Salut les gars, comment ça va? J'espère que vous allez bien. Chez moi, ça va. Ça va un peu. Ça va un peu, ça va. Bon, on va continuer où on en était. On était ici, positioning. Ça va être une leçon intéressante. Ok, on était là. Jusqu'à présent, tu as, excusez, jusqu'à présent, jusqu'à présent, tu as eu le temps de t'exercer à bouger les éléments autour de l'écran en utilisant des choses telles que margin, padding et flexbox. Ces techniques sont reliées au mode de positionnement par défaut CSS. Ces techniques euh, sont toutes ces techniques se basent toutes sur le mode par défaut, sur le position mode de CSS. Ce mode de positionnement par défaut est intuitif et tu continueras à l'utiliser pour presque tout tes layouts, c'est positionnement, bon, emplacement, disposition, tout comme ça. Pour tous tes besoins de disposition. Toutefois, il y a des méthodes à ta disposition qui peuvent être très utiles dans certaines situations. Voilà, tu apprendras à utiliser le positionnement absolu, le positionnement fixé, le positionnement collant. Tu comprendras la différence entre chaque propriété et comment les combiner. Positionnement statique et relatif. Le mode de positionnement par défaut que tu t'es habitué à utiliser est position statique. La différence entre statique et relative est très simple. Statique, c'est la position par défaut de tout élément et propriété top, right, bottom and left. Les propriétés top, right n'affectent pas le positionnement de l'élément. Relatif, relatif, c'est un peu la même chose que statique, mais les propriétés top, right déplacent l'élément relatif à sa position normale dans le flow du document. On aura traduit un peu tout ce charabia là. Donc, des fois auxquelles vous êtes habitué à la position statique. La différence entre la statique et la position par défaut de chaque élément. De chaque des propriétés n'en fait pas. La position relative, quant à elle, est à peu près la même que la position statique. Les propriétés top et ça déplace l'élément par rapport à sa position normale dans le flux du document. Contrefond. Positionnement absolu. Position absolue te permet de positionner quelque chose à un point exact sur l'écran sans déranger les autres éléments autour. Plus particulièrement, utiliser le positionnement absolu sur un élément supprimera cet élément du flux normal du document tout en étant positionné relativement à un élément ancêtre. De manière simple, les éléments qui sont supprimés du flux normal du document n'affectent pas les autres éléments et ne sont pas affectés par les autres éléments. Ok, en utilisant le positionnement absolu. Utiliser le positionnement absolu te permet de positionner les éléments n'importe où sur l'écran en utilisant top, right, bottom and left. Les propriétés top, right, bottom and left. Cette propriété est très utile lorsque tu veux positionner quelque chose à un point exact sur l'écran sans déranger n'importe quel autre élément. De bons usages de positionnement absolu sont les modals. Modals, comment je peux traduire les modals? Modèle, modèle. Image avec un caption. Les icônes par-dessus d'autres éléments. This is a cool heading. This is some cool placeholder. Position relative. Position absolute. Card image. Position absolute. Top. Disclaimer. Comment on peut traduire disclaimer? Attention. Mais ça va. Disclaimer. Position absolue à des utilisations très spécifiques et si possible utiliser Flexbox ou devrait être priorisé. Positionnement absolu ne devrait pas être utilisé pour faire l'agencement des pages entières. Positionnement fixe. Les éléments fixés sont aussi supprimés du flow normal du document et sont positionnés selon viewport. Tu utilises les propriétés top, right, bottom and left pour les positionner. Et il restera ainsi pendant que l'utilisateur défile. C'est particulièrement utile pour les choses telles que les barres de navigation et les boutons de chat flottants. Ok. Positionnement collant. Stick et positioning. Positionnement collant. Stick elements. Les éléments collants se comporteront comme des éléments normaux jusqu'à ce que tu défiles, tu les dépasses en défilant. Puis, ils commenceront à se comporter comme des éléments fixes. Ils ne sont, ils ne sont pas, ils ne sont pas non plus euh, jetés ou bien ils ne sont pas non plus sortis du flot normal du document. Ça peut sembler confus. Donc, regarde cet exemple qui pourrait éclaircir les choses. Il est utile pour des choses telles que des headers, des titres de section. Souvenez-vous être capable de voir quelle catégorie vous regardez pendant que vous scrollez à travers une boutique. Voici comment c'est fait. Voyons l'exemple. Tu scrolles, toi. Ah, ok, je vois. Ah ouais, c'est quand tu scrolles pour le dépasser, il devient. Ok, je vois. Intéressant. Oh, c'est quoi ce truc? Image. Yo. Ah, lui seul, il fait combien? Je sais pas combien de lignes. Ah, c'est quoi? C'est pas ça, c'est de l'URL. C'est quoi cette URL de dingue? Hmm, quelle est cette langue? Anglais, vous vous foutez de ma gueule? Web Dev Simplify Land Position Video. What is the difference between static and relative? Static, c'est le flow normal, relative.
Hello everybody. Welcome back to Web
2 millions de vues. Crazy.
Simplified. In today's video, I'm going to be teaching you everything you need to know about CSS positioning, so by the time that this video is over, you're going to be positioning elements like a CSS god. Let's get started now. To demonstrate all 5 of the different CSS properties for position, I have a simple example set up. We have a parent element, as well as 3 childs inside of that parent element, and right now there's absolutely no position styles being applied to them, only these default styles for coloring it. And if we come in here and we want to inspect one of these elements, to figure out how the position is being applied by default, we can go to the Computed tab, we can search for position, and if we see right here, our position property is set to static by default. And static is the default position that all of your HTML elements will have, styles being applied to them, only these default styles for coloring it. And if we come in here and we want to inspect one of these elements, to figure out how the position is being applied by default, we can go to the Computed tab, we can search for position, and if we see right here, our position property is set to static by default. And static is the default position that all of your HTML elements will have when they enter onto the page. And essentially all static positioning does is it says that it should follow the other elements in the document flow, so whatever comes first in our HTML, for example, child number 1, will be above child number 2, and so on. So static positioning is just like how your HTML works when you type it out, and it's what you're most used to. The next CSS position that we want to cover is relative position, and this works almost exactly the same as static positioning. So if we go in here and we want to change our green child here, child number 1, to be positioned relative, and we save that, and you'll notice absolutely nothing over here has changed. And that's because relative position acts exactly like static positioning, but it allows you to do 4 specific things that static positioning does not. And that is that you can change the top, left, right, and bottom of this element. So let me just show you an example of that. We can come in here and we can change the left, for example, to 10 pixels. If we save that, you see the element moves itself over 10 pixels. It even overflows its parent by 10 pixels on the right side. And that's because relative allows you to actually change the position of the element relative to where it normally would be in the document flow if it was statically positioned. So as you can see, normally this 1 would take up this space here inside of the parent, but because of the left 10, it's moved over 10 pixels. And for example, if we put top here to be 10 and save it, you see that it actually overflows the elements below it. Because relative position, when you apply top, left, right, and bottom, it actually takes that element out of the document flow and moves it down, or left, or right, or up, those 10 pixels that you specified. And the reason that this element 2 and 3 are not actually being pushed down when this top element is being pushed down is because, like I said, it was removed from the document flow, so it no longer works just like a statically positioned element. You can see here that the position where 1 normally would be is taken up, and that is reserved for where 1 is, and the actual element 1 is just moved by these top, left, right, and bottom elements that we applied to it. In general, you're almost never going to be using top, left, right, and bottom on a position relative element, because all that does is move your element out of the document flow, and it becomes really difficult to style things around it, since as you can see, our element 2 is now no longer in line with 1, so we would have to also position the relative number 2 exactly the same, and then we'd have to do the exact same thing with number 3, and so on, and it gets really confusing when you start using that. So in general, position relative is not actually used for using top, left, right, and bottom. The next element that we want to talk about for position is absolute, and that one most definitely gets used with top, left, right, and bottom. So let's put an absolute on here, remove our top, save everything, and you can see that already things have changed drastically from before when we had no position. This is with no position, and then position absolute. And as you can see, the document actually completely ignores this one element right here. It just pretends like it was completely deleted. And for example, if we go into our index.html here, and we delete this one element and save it, all of the rest of our elements work exactly the same as before. We add it back in, you see nothing else moves except for that one element. And that's because position absolute completely removes the element from the document flow, and everything else renders as if that absolute element didn't even exist at all. And that is crucially important. This makes position absolute really useful for when you want to stick something in a specific position, but you don't want anything else to move around it. And as I mentioned, position absolute allows you to do top, left, right, and bottom to it. And you'll notice if we put a top on here of, let's just say 10 pixels, something really weird is going to happen. If we save that, you see that this element is actually 10 pixels from the very top of our screen. If we set this to 0 and save, you can really see that it's just at the very top of the screen. But why is that? Shouldn't it be down here, 0 pixels from itself? And that is incorrect because that's what relative position does. Absolute position absolutely positions an element inside of some parent container that it can reference. So you would think it would reference this parent, but this parent is positioned static, which means it can't have anything else positioned absolutely or relatively to it. In order to change an element so that you can position something absolutely or relatively to it, you need to use one of the other positioning elements of either relative, absolute, sticky, or fixed in order to make an element position absolutely inside of it. So if we change parent here to position relative, which this is the most common use case for position relative, you'll see now our absolute position element is relative to the position relative. You'll see now our absolute position element is relative to the position relative parent. And this is where relative is really useful. It's when you want to absolutely position something inside of it, you need to make sure that element has position relative. Otherwise, that element will just fall back to the next relatively positioned parent or all the way back to the HTML element itself. So this is where relative and absolute play really nicely together. So just to reiterate the positions we've gone over already, static is the default. Relative is exactly the same as static, but you can relatively position it to itself using top, left, bottom, and right. And then absolute is just like relative in the fact that you can position it relative using top, left, right, and bottom, but it completely removes it from the document flow so that all the other elements ignore it completely. And relative and absolute play
Voilà, est-ce que vous comprenez? Moi, je comprends. Je comprends.
nicely because any that is relatively positioned can have absolutely positioned elements inside of it that'll be relative to that relative position element. And that works for every position, not just relative. We could change this here to be absolute as well, and you can see still that one element is relative to the parent because the parent has some other position than static. And that's really important. Anytime you have a position other than static, absolute element will use that as its parent that it's absolutely positioned inside of. So let's remove that because we don't actually want this. We can keep it as relative. And now we can move on to the next type of positioning, which is fixed positioning, which is very similar to absolute positioning, but there's some caveats regarding it. So let's change this to be position fixed here and save it. And you see immediately it completely ignores this relative position parent and moves all the way to the top. And that's because fixed position elements are always fixed positioned based on the entire HTML element. It has nothing to do with parents. Also, something really unique about fixed position elements is they stay in the same place when you scroll. So let's make our page very large. We're going to change the height here to 200 view height so it'll be able to scroll. And if we save that, we can scroll down. You see that this one element still sticks to the very top of our page because it's got top of 0. For example, if we put the right to 0 as well and say that, you can see it sticks now to the top right, no matter how far we scroll. But absolute does not work that way. If we change this to absolute, you can see it's in the top right here, but if we scroll, you can see it stays there. It doesn't actually move when you scroll, and that's the big difference between fixed and absolute. Fixed moves with the page as you scroll and is always in the same exact position on the page, and also it positions itself based on the entire HTML page and not just the parent that has the correct positioning, relative, absolute, etc. on it. And those are the real big differences between absolute and fixed. And now the last position that we need to cover is position sticky, and I'm not going to go super in-depth in position sticky because I have an entire video covering it, so if you want to check that out, make sure you check the description and the cards for this video to find that sticky video. But essentially, sticky position is a combination of both relative position and fixed position into one. So let's go down here to our child 1. We're going to make this sticky position. We'll get rid of the right, we'll just have top here. And if we save that, you'll see it looks just normal, just like it was relatively positioned. But as we scroll down, as soon as this element hits the top of our page, since we have our top set to 0, it'll become fixed position now. And as you can see, as we scroll, it stays fixed to the top of our page with that top of 0. And that's really the power of sticky position, is by default, it's relative, but as soon as it scrolls outside of the page, it becomes fixed position. And that's it. Position in CSS is really that easy. You have the default static position, you have the relative position, which works just like static, but you can move it based on itself, absolute, which works just like relative, but it's moved based on its parent element, that is using position, relative, absolute, sticky, or fixed. And we also have sticky position, which works just like fixed and relative, and lastly, fixed position, which allows you to put an element on the page and it'll stay there no matter where the user moves to with the scroll wheel. So I really hope you guys enjoyed this video and have a little bit more understanding of the different positions inside of CSS. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment down below letting me know what other videos you want me to make in the future. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.
Once upon a time, I was making a website for a client. The client had a designer, and this was the design they wanted me to code. It was pretty standard, almost everything is flexbox, and the idea was that the website was floating in space. Then the designer thought that his design needed more space elements, and so he sent me 5 images that I was supposed to position in strategic places to deepen the illusion of being in space. Positioning these images directly on the page would break the layout, so I needed a way to position them without moving other elements around. To start using CSS positions, we first need some elements in our HTML. All I have is a div with the class of container and 12 items nested inside of it. Each item is a div with the class of item and item 1, 2, 3, and so on. When I save, we see we actually have a grid. This is because I have some base styles in a separate CSS file. None of this is relevant to CSS positioning. You don't need a container with 12 items, and you don't need a grid to start using the CSS positioning properties. All of this is just for demonstration purposes. In a fresh CSS file, I'll select the first item in our grid by its class name and give it the position property. In total, there are 5 position values: absolute, relative, fixed, sticky, and static. When I set the position on our item 1 to absolute, we see that an item from our grid disappeared. We have 1, 3, 4, 5, and so on, but we don't see item 2, and this is because it's hidden underneath item 1. To move item 1, we can use the top, right, bottom, and left properties. These properties are unlocked when we assign a position property to an element. If I give the top property the value of 0 pixels, we see now our item is positioned at the top of the page. And also the reason we're missing an item from our grid is because when we set item 1 to have a position of absolute, item 1 got removed from the grid. Actually, it got removed from the entire document. Elements that are assigned a position of absolute are removed from the document. No space is created for them, and other elements will behave as if that element never existed. If I set left to 0 pixels, now our item is on the top left corner. If I set the bottom to 0 pixels, nothing happens. This is because it doesn't make sense to have both a top and a bottom. I can comment out the top property, and now with the bottom of 0 pixels, we see that the element is positioned at the bottom left corner. The same goes for the left and right properties. I use one of them, but not both at the same time. I'll comment out the left property and set the right property to 0 pixels. I'll also comment out the bottom property and set the top property to 0 pixels. Now our item is positioned at the top right corner, but what happens if I give our top and right properties some negative numbers? I'll set both to -50 pixels, and now our item is half visible. This is pretty cool, but we've got some horizontal scrolling. I can select the body and give it the overflow X of hidden, and now the horizontal scrolling is gone. Did you notice, whenever we were defining values on the top, right, bottom, and left properties, that those values were positioning item 1 relative to the entire page? -50 pixels on the top and right properties places item 1 at the top right corner of the entire page. If I wanted item 1 to position itself relative to its parent, then we need to select the parent and give it a position. Any position value will work except static because static is the default value. I'll set the position to relative, and now we see item 1 is being positioned relative to the parent instead of the entire page. The way this works is over on the HTML, item 1 is asking the parent whether it has a position property. If not, then it asks the next parent, and then next, and then next, until it finds one with a position property defined. And if it doesn't find one, then it defaults to being positioned relative to the HTML element. Now that item 1 is being positioned relative to the container, it's stacking itself above item 5. If we wanted item 1 to be layered underneath item 5, what we can do is use the z-index property and set it to -1. Back on my client's website, I give the planet the position of absolute. The planet is now removed from the document but is stacking above other elements. I use the z-index property to layer the planet underneath the other elements. Also, I give the planet an opacity of 0.3 because the planet is way too bright. I played around with the top and right properties until I was happy with the position, and I also added an overflow X of hidden on the body to remove the horizontal scroll bar. And finally, I repeated the same process for all the other images. If I select item 1 and give it the position of static, we see nothing happens. If I give it a top property of 0 pixels, nothing happens. If I set it to 1000 pixels, still nothing happens. Nothing is happening because static elements don't have access to the top, right, bottom, and left properties, nor do they have access to the z-index property. On the other hand, if I set item 1 to have a position of relative, we see again nothing happens, but unlike the static position, relative has access to the top, right, bottom, left, and z-index properties. If I give it a top property of 0 pixels, it doesn't move. However, if I set it to 100 pixels, we see it pushed it 100 pixels away from the top. If I give it a left property of 100 pixels, we see now it pushed it 100 pixels away from the left. Unlike the position of absolute, elements with the position of relative remain in the normal flow of the document. Use relative when you want to keep your element in the normal flow of the document, and use absolute when you want to remove your element from the normal flow of the document. On the footer, I want to push this animation slightly towards the right. Normally, I would just use a margin left, but in this case, I can't, because I set the width and height with percentages, and if I use margins, the animation would shrink. So what I can do is give the animation the position of relative and use the left property to push it slightly to the right without it shrinking. The two final positions are fixed and sticky. They both stick an element into position, but they do it slightly differently. Fixed actually behaves very similarly to the absolute position. Like absolute, elements with the position of fixed are removed from the document. So when I set item 1 to a position of fixed, we get the same behavior as we did when we were working with absolutes. Item 1 was removed from the entire document and is currently layered on top of item 2, which is why we don't see item 2. However, one area where fixed is different than absolute is when we start scrolling. We see item 1 is now following us when we're scrolling the page. The second area where fixed differs from absolute is, unlike the absolute element, a fixed element is always positioned relative to the HTML element. I can set item 1 with of 0 pixels, and this will stick it to the top of the page. I'll also give it a left of 0 pixels, a border radius of 0, a width of 100%, and a z-index of 1. Guess what? We now have a header. I can also have it be a bottom header by replacing top with bottom. And now we have a bottom header. The sticky position works similarly to both relative and fixed. I'll select item 5 and give it the position of sticky. We see nothing happened, and also if I scroll the page, nothing is happening. But if I give it a top of 0 pixels and start scrolling, now item 5 is scrolling down with us until it hits the end of the container. Sticky only works when we define a top property. The value we put in the top property represents the space before the element will start scrolling down with the page. If I set top to 50 pixels, now the space between the element and the top of the viewport needs to be 50 pixels before the element starts sticking to it. The client requested a bottom header indicating that the website is still under development, and also requested that the text and the builder section stick to the page when scrolling. To create the heading, I add a div with the class of bottom heading. I give it the position of fixed, the bottom of 0 pixels, the left of 0 pixels, the width of 100%, a background color, a color, and a z-index of 1. Then for this section to stick when scrolling, all I have to do is give it the position of sticky and also give it a top property. After all these changes were made, I had a happy client and he left me a nice review on Upwork. This is pretty much everything you need to know to start positioning things yourself. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking.
Fonctions CSS sont des fonctions. Tu dois avoir déjà remarqué, tu peux avoir remarqué que certaines valeurs de propriété avec lesquelles tu as travaillé en CSS ont une syntaxe légèrement différente. Lorsque la valeur est un mot suivi par une paire de parenthèses, contenant des informations entre elles, telles que background color, tu es dans une fonction et tu utilises une fonction CSS. Ce sont des fonctions, je ne savais même pas. Dans cette leçon, nous allons couvrir les bases de ce qu'est une fonction et quelques manières générales qu'elles sont utilisées en CSS. Pour connaître les parties basiques d'une fonction CSS, connaître calque, min, max, clamp. Clamp, je ne connais pas. Qu'est-ce qu'une fonction et comment l'utiliser en CSS? Similaire au langage de programmation, les fonctions au CSS sont des bouts de code réutilisables qui performent des tâches spécifiques. Fonctions sont passées. Les fonctions sont passées en tant que paramètres, arguments, entre les parenthèses. Chacune est utilisée par la fonction d'une manière spécifique. Attendez, je reviens. Ici, la valeur de couleur est la fonction RGB qui accepte des paramètres dans la forme de nombre. Il processe, traduit, traite, ok. De manière similaire, la propriété banque a une valeur de linéaire gradient. Linéaire gradient génère un gradient d'image en utilisant les paramètres qui lui sont donnés, qui ont été donnés. Il a besoin d'au moins deux couleurs de paramètres, deux couleurs pour transitionner entre. De plus, tu peux mettre en place, tu peux configurer l'angle de la direction de la ligne des gradients, ajouter plus de valeurs de couleurs, etc. Pas comme le langage de programmation que tu utiliseras dans Odin Project. CSS ne te permet pas de créer tes propres fonctions. Au lieu de ça, le langage vient avec une liste de fonctions prédéterminées, préfaites, qui t'aideront à résoudre les problèmes les plus basiques en matière de style. Besides, enfin, outre la définition de couleur, il y a plusieurs fonctions CSS qui sont utiles pour designer l'agencement et la taille. Sizing, ça va. La mise en page et le dimensionnement. Voyons ces quelques fonctions. Calc, min, max, clamp. Les cas les plus puissants d'utilisation pour calc sont mixer des unités, la capacité comment dire, nester, d'imbriquer, calc, calc, calc. Ok. Ouais, j'ai vu. Ce sont tous des exemples de variables que tu en apprendras plus dans les prochaines leçons. Sans viewport, moins header, plus footer. Ok. Je devrais être capable de maîtriser comment calque est utilisé dans le code pen intégré ci-dessus. On t'encourage à jouer avec les différentes unités et tailles des éléments pour voir quel résultat tu obtiens avant d'avancer. Mine. Mine fait un excellent job en créant des sites web responsables et responsives. Regardez ça. Mets ton attention sur la ligne 8. On peut faire plusieurs observations ici. S'il y a 150 pixels disponibles sur l'image, il prendra tous les 150 pixels. S'il n'y a pas 150 pixels disponibles, l'image va basculer vers 100% de la largeur du plan. Quand tu réduis celle-là, il y a 150. Donc quand tu augmentes, celle-là, ça commence à prendre la largeur du plan. Intéressant. Même chose pour la hauteur. Et là, j'ai bloqué. Là, je peux plus revenir. Je crois que j'ai bloqué. Dans le premier cas, mine sélectionne 150 pixels. Vu que 150 pixels est plus petit, le plus petit entre 150 pixels et 100% de la largeur du parent. Le parent, déjà, sa largeur, c'est pas précisé. Ensuite, il choisit 100%. Min se comporte en tant que euh, limite du maximum, de la valeur maximum permis. Et dans cet exemple, 150 pixels. De email. Ok, j'ai pas mis le truc. Limite. Tu es capable de faire des maths basiques à l'intérieur des mines. Par exemple, mine. Ok, max. Max fonctionne de la même manière que min. Seulement à l'envers. Il sélectionnera la valeur la plus large, la plus grande entre ces parenthèses. Tu peux penser de max comme un garant de permettre la valeur minimum d'une propriété. Au maximum, c'est 100. Enfin, de cette liste, de différentes tailles, Max sélectionnera la plus large. Tant que 4M ou 50% euh, correspond à des longueurs plus grandes que 100 pixels, Max sélectionnera l'une d'entre elles. Si elles sont inférieures à 100 pixels, peut-être parce que l'utilisateur a des préférences de police et des tailles de police, ou que le, l'écran, la fenêtre du navigateur, etc., etc. S'ils sont plus petits que 100 pixels, alors 100 pixels gagnera en tant que le plus large. Tu peux penser des 100 pixels en tant, tu peux penser des 100 pixels dans cet exemple en tant que valeur de. Il pleut. Clamp est une bonne manière de rendre les éléments fluides et responsifs. Clamp en trois valeurs. La plus petite, la valeur idéale la plus large. La fonction CSS clamp utilise les valeurs pour mettre en place la valeur la plus petite, idéale et la plus large. Dans l'exemple ci-dessus, cela signifierait que la plus petite valeur acceptable de font size serait 320 pixels. La plus large serait 613. La valeur idéale serait 80. Viewport width, take a look at the complete distance. Demain, on va regarder cette vidéo et puis on va passer à autre chose. Donc, les gamins, c'est tout pour aujourd'hui. J'arrête aujourd'hui. Comme vous le voyez, je somnole. J'ai un peu sommeil. Donc, on va se dire à demain, allez, plus.